Jeffrey Dahmer, a name infamous for murder, misery, and sadness. He is one of the most notorious serial killers in the world's history, still being discussed nearly 30 years later, dubbed the Milwaukee Cannibal. But what led to this psychotic rampage that nearly went undetected for over a decade? Hello and welcome to Seeking Answers, and this is the life and crimes of Jeffrey Dahmer. Jeffrey Lionel Dahmer was born on May the 21st, 1960 in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, to teletype machine instructor Joyce Annette and Marquette University chemistry student Lionel Dahmer. As a child, Jeffrey was believed to have been neglected and deprived of a lot of attention, though others claim he was actually doted upon as an infant and toddler by both parents.
Jeff was raised with all the love and care and concern that any child could be raised with, and what happened to him, I don't know. I wish I knew. I'd give anything to know. I asked the universe, why would this be allowed to happen? I don't have an answer for that.
But it's worth noting that his mother Joyce would often argue with her husband and their neighbours, and was known for often being tense and hungry for attention. Jeffrey entered his first grade at school when Joyce fell ill and spent most of her time in bed, while his father Lionel was always busy with his university studies, keeping him away from home. Whenever he was around, his wife, who suffered from depression but was also diagnosed with hypochondria, would often demand his constant attention. Joyce would consistently work herself into a state of anxiety trying to please her husband, and she even attempted suicide via overdose on Equinil. Due to their busy and neglectful home life, Jeffrey received very little attention from either parent.
Jeff's first grade teacher described him as inordinately shy, said that he stayed away from all the kids out here on the playground and seemed to be profoundly unhappy. Shouldn't that have set off some kind of alarm?
We visited the teacher, and we became very concerned, as she did. But I thought it was just shyness, as I had gone through when I was a youngster in school.
But what for you had been shyness, for him was becoming near total isolation.
That's right. In retrospect, that's very true.
Despite this, he was a happy and energetic child, but shortly before he turned the age of 4, he required a double hernia surgery, which severely damaged his health. Some believe that it was this operation that was a contributing factor and altered Dahmer's mental state permanently, as he was no longer that same happy and energetic child from that point on, though others believe it wasn't the case.
What was he like as a young boy?
Wonderful. I thought he was wonderful. Jeff was the most beautiful, darling, sweetest baby, the nicest young boy.
There just were no real signs.
Your dad says that somewhere around the age of 6, he thought that you began to change, that you began to withdraw, that you became much more shy.
Oh yeah, that's the time I really remember noticing that things weren't quite right.
So it wasn't so much innate shyness as it was wanting to withdraw from tension and arguments and problems in the house.
That's how I saw it, yeah.
Though it is worth noting that Joyce took a lot of medication during her entire pregnancy, which also could have been a factor.
Were you prescribed medications, including morphine, barbiturates?
I don't know what medications were prescribed, and I had a doctor, a physician. I took the medicine that was prescribed for me, and for the most part I was healthy. There was nothing that was out of the ordinary as far as my pregnancy was concerned.
and some believe that Jeffrey showed signs of Asperger's syndrome, though this was never diagnosed. He would witness a lot of tension and frequent arguments between his parents during his early years, and as he started elementary school, he was quiet and timid. One teacher even suspected that he was being neglected due to his mother's illness, but no further investigation was done.
There were times when he heard the shouting and he went outside and just left the house. I learned later that he was slapping the trees with branches and sticks, and I guess apparently out of frustration.
When you think back on those times, the arguments and the possible effect, does it cause you anguish?
It makes me sick. It really makes me sick.
It was unnerving, depressing, made me angry sometimes. I'd leave the house, go out in the woods and sulk, brooding, wondering why they had to have such a rough relationship.
Despite this, as he grew older, he did gain a small number of friends, but he was always interested in dead animals. It's believed to have started when he was just 4 years old. His father removed some animal bones from underneath the family home, and Jeffrey seemed to enjoy the sounds of the bones cracking.
I noticed that Jeff had picked up these bones and just let them drop back down into the bucket. They made a clanging noise, and he seemed sort of entranced by that. He just said, as he dropped them down, it's just like fiddlesticks, he said.
He soon collected large insects such as dragonflies and butterflies and kept them all in jars. But this hobby led to him collecting dead animal bodies from the road, sometimes even doing this with a friend. He would then dismember the carcasses either at home or in the nearby woods. One friend claimed that he would store the body parts in jars in the family's shed. He was just fascinated with how the bodies fit together.
All I know is that I wanted to see what the insides of these animals looked like. There may have been some violence involved, some underlying subconscious feelings of violence. It was a compulsion, became a compulsion.
When he was 4 and pointed to his belly button and asked what would happen if someone cut it out, was that merely an ordinary question from a child who had begun to explore his own body? Or was it a sign of something morbid already growing in his mind? When we went fishing, and he seemed captivated by the gutted fish, staring intently at the brightly colored entrails, was that a child's natural curiosity, or was it a harbinger of the horror that was later to be found in apartment 213?
Dahmer's father Lionel never found this behavior alarming. In fact, he even encouraged it, believing that his son had finally gained an interesting hobby in the art of science. But in one instance, Jeffrey cut the head off a dead dog, nailed the body to a tree, and impaled its skull on a stake next to a wooden cross in the woods near his home.
Was there some pleasure in the cutting open of the animal?
Yes, there was. No sexual pleasure, but just it's hard to describe.
Sense of power, sense of control?
I suppose that's a good way of putting it, yeah. In 9th grade, in biology class, we had the usual dissection of fetal pigs, and I took the remains of that home and kept the skeleton of it. And I just started branching out, dogs, cats. I suppose it could have turned into a normal hobby like taxidermy, but it didn't. It veered off into this.
He would often search under and around his home for skeletons, or explored the bodies of live animals to find the location of their bones. In October of 1966, Jeffrey, now 6 years old, moved with his family to Doylestown, Ohio. In December, Joyce gave birth to another little boy and allowed her elder son to name him. He chose to call him David Dahmer. That same year, Lionel earned his degree and began work as an analytical chemist in Akron, Ohio, which was nearby. 2 years passed before the family once again moved to Bath Township, Ohio. And 2 years later, during a chicken dinner, Jeffrey, now 10, asked his father what would happen if chicken bones were placed into bleach. Lionel didn't question his son's curiosity and found it quite endearing. He even showed him how to safely use bleach to preserve animal bones. Jeffrey would later use this technique for so many of his victims.
He was fun. We did all of the normal things that people do. If I'd seen something that had been a clue of any kind, I'd like to think that I would have done something about it immediately. No, there wasn't anything unusual about Jeff.
As Jeffrey Dahmer started at Revere High School, he was often seen as the outcast. He began drinking hard alcohol at the age of 14, telling classmates it was just his medicine. His friends noticed him smuggling the booze into class, even storing them in his locker. The faculty found him polite and highly intelligent, but with average grades, though he would hardly even talk to people. Jeffrey briefly participated in the high school band and was an avid tennis player, but the teachers believed his grades only failed because of his laziness and not due to lack of intelligence.
One of your dad's biggest questions is when you began to slip away, when you crossed over into this world of obsession or dark fantasy from which you just couldn't return.
I think it was around age 14 or 15. I started having these obsessive thoughts when I was about 15 and 16, and they got worse and worse.
What were your fantasies about?
They were sexual fantasies of control, power, complete dominance. They became reality.
Was there pleasure in that fantasy?
There was excitement, fear, pleasure, all mixed together.
By the time he hit puberty, Jeffrey discovered that he was gay, though he did not inform his parents.
Never understood it. There was no use trying to fight it because I couldn't rid myself of it. It was too powerful and persistent.
Do you dislike it?
Yes, it's caused a lot of problems for me. A lot of conflicts and unanswered questions.
Did you ever consider talking to your parents, to your dad, about homosexuality? Is that something that you felt you could ever raise?
Early on, I really didn't know that much about it myself. All I knew was that it was something that was to be kept hush-hush, not talked about, not even thought about. So I just kept it all within me and never talked about sexual issues at all, really, with anybody.
If Jeff had come to you and said, "Dad, I'm a homosexual," how would you have reacted?
I think I would have started in on a program to try to change his thinking.
So you would not have been accepting?
No.
Do you believe to this day that he is, as a homosexual, living in a state of sin?
If you believe the inspired word of God, which I do, that is sin. It's repugnant to God.
Do you think Jeff was ashamed of his homosexuality?
I think so.
In his early teen years, he had a short relationship with an unknown teenage boy, though they never had sexual intercourse. However, it was this relationship where Dahmer began to fantasize about dominating and controlling a male partner. However, these fantasies would escalate until he began to dream of dissecting them as well.
It's a process. It doesn't happen overnight. When you depersonalize another person and view them as just an object for pleasure instead of a living, breathing human being, it seems to make it easier to do things you shouldn't do.
Dahmer turned 16 and he noticed a local man who would often go jogging around the area, and he found him attractive. Jeffrey hid inside some bushes with a baseball bat, waiting for the man to run past, but on this particular day, he didn't show up, and no incident occurred. This was, however, Jeffrey Dahmer's first ever attempt at attacking someone.
Do you know what started it? Was there any kind of incident that you can remember?
To this day, I don't know what started it. And the person to blame is sitting right across from you. That's the only person. Not parents, not society, not pornography. I mean, those are just excuses.
Despite being quiet, Dahmer would often stage pranks at school, becoming known as the class clown, even leading to him faking epileptic seizures or cerebral palsy at school or in local supermarkets. By 1977, Dahmer's grades began to decline further, leading to his parents hiring him a private tutor to no avail. That same year, his parents sought marriage counselling in an attempt to save their relationship, as their arguments continued. Lionel soon discovered that Joyce had had an affair, so they agreed to divorce, but to do so amicably. Lionel moved out in early 1978, leaving the two boys in her care. Jeffrey continued his drinking problem, even leading to a teacher spotting him sitting near the school's car park, downing several cans of beer. They threatened to report the incident, but Jeffrey claimed he was experiencing a lot of problems at home and that the school's guidance counselor was fully aware of them. Just a few weeks later, Dahmer graduated from high school. That same year, Joyce moved out with her youngest son David to live with some relatives. Dahmer was now 18 and he chose to remain in the family house alone. His parents' divorce was finalized on July the 24th, 1978. 3 weeks after Jeffrey Dahmer graduated from high school, and his long rampage would begin.
The first killing was not planned. I was coming back from the shopping mall back in '78. I had had fantasies about picking up a hitchhiker and taking him back to the house and having complete control and dominance over him. I never in my wildest nightmares thought that it would become a reality. He caught my eye. I drove past him, thought to myself, should I stop and pick him up or should I just keep on going? I wish I just kept on going, but I didn't. I turned around, picked him up, and that's when the nightmare became a reality.
At this point, his father Lionel was temporarily living in a nearby motel, and Joyce and David were in Chippewa Falls, Wisconsin, while Jeffrey lived alone in Bath Township. On June the 18th, 1978, Jeffrey Dahmer picked up a hitchhiker by the name of Stephen Mark Hicks, who was about to turn 19. Dahmer noticed Hicks' bare chest, which gained his immediate interest, inviting him back to his place to share some drinks. Hicks was on his way to a rock concert in Lockwood Corners, but did agree to his company. They hung out for a few hours drinking and listening to music, until Hicks wanted to leave, but Dahmer didn't like that idea.
I had these obsessive desires and thoughts wanting to control them, to, I don't know how to put it, possess them permanently.
And that's why you killed them.
Right. Not because I was angry with them, not because I hated them, but because I wanted to keep them with me.
Was this about some kind of desire to keep these people with you, not to be abandoned, not to have them leave?
I think that did play into it, but there was a big element of wanting complete control over someone, total control, not having to consider their wishes, being able to keep them there as long as I wanted.
He bludgeoned Stephen Hicks with a 10-pound dumbbell from behind, twice as he sat in a chair. Once unconscious, Dahmer strangled him to death with the bar of the dumbbell, before stripping him naked and masturbating over the corpse.
Once it happened the first time, it just seemed like it had control of my life from there on end. It was a major part of my thinking from then on.
The next day, Jeffrey dissected Hicks' body in his basement before burying the remains in a grave in his backyard. However, just a few weeks later, Dahmer dug up the remains before cutting the flesh off of the bones. He then dissolved the skin in acid before flushing the solution down the toilet, and crushing the bones with a sledgehammer before scattering them in some nearby woods.
When you killed these men, afterwards, were you repulsed Were you upset?
No, at the time, it was almost addictive. It was almost a surge of energy. I wouldn't have to worry about any of their needs or anything. I just had complete control of the situation.
6 weeks later, Dahmer's father Lionel and his new fiancée Sherry returned to the home to move in. They noticed a change in Jeffrey's demeanour, and Lionel even spotted his son's bedroom at one point, completely covered with empty liquor bottles.
What was the scene like when you came into the house and saw him?
He had a dead look in his eye, and he just looked extremely sad.
He was wandering aimlessly about the house. He was very uncomfortable.
That August, Jeffrey enrolled at Ohio State University, wishing to major in business studies. However, he was incredibly unproductive due to his constant alcohol abuse throughout the entire term. His grades all failed except riflery, which was only a B-. Lionel had paid for the entire year in advance, but Jeffrey dropped out after just 3 months. In January, his father managed to convince Jeffrey to enlist in the United States Army, where he trained as a medical specialist in San Antonio, Texas. On July the 13th, he was stationed in Baumholder, West Germany as a combat medic, and he was described as a somewhat decent soldier.
What happened to you in the 9 years in between that you were able to stop, that you were able to control yourself?
It just wasn't an opportunity to fully express what I wanted to do. There was just not the physical opportunity to do it then.
However, years later, 2 soldiers came out to claim that Dahmer raped them during his time there. One, claiming to have been Dahmer's roommate, stated that Jeffrey raped him frequently over the course of 17 months, while the other claims Dahmer drugged and raped him inside an armoured personnel carrier. Allegedly, Dahmer would even consume alcohol in the barracks and, in a drunken state, would confess to the soldiers that he murdered the guy in Ohio. But nobody took him seriously, and nobody reported it.
No one had a clue as to what was happening for over a decade.
As Jeffrey continued to abuse alcohol, his performance deteriorated, and in March of 1981, he was deemed unsuitable for the military and was discharged from the army. On March the 24th, Dahmer was sent to Fort Jackson, South Carolina for debriefing and was given a plane ticket to travel anywhere in the entire country. However, he couldn't bear to face his father after failing him, and instead headed to Miami Beach, Florida. He managed to get a job at a delicatessen and rented a room in a motel, but most of his wages were spent on alcohol, and he was soon evicted after failing to pay the rent. He began to spend his evenings on the beach as he continued to work at the delicatessen, but he did end up gaining the courage to phone up his father and asked to return to their home in Ohio. In September, he returned to live with his father and stepmother, helping with the chores while he looked for further employment. He continued to drink, and just 2 weeks after coming home, he was arrested for drunk and disorderly conduct, being fined for $60 and given a suspended 10-day jail sentence. Lionel tried his best to get his son clean off the alcohol, but all attempts failed. In December, Lionel and Sherry sent Jeffrey to live with his grandmother in West Allis, Wisconsin. His grandmother is the only family member who Jeffrey would ever talk about with any kind of affection. The family hoped that her influence, as well as a change of scenery, might help Jeffrey clear his head and get off the alcohol. At first, it went well. He went with his grandmother to church, he did all the chores, sought employment, and followed all of her rules. But he continued to frequently drink and smoke. In early 1982, he did manage to get a job as a phlebotomist at the Milwaukee Blood Plasma Center. He managed to hold this job for 10 months before being laid off. For the 2 years that followed, Dahmer remained unemployed and solely relied on his grandmother to financially support him. On August 7th, 1982, not long before losing his job, Jeffrey Dahmer visited Wisconsin State Fair Park and exposed himself to a crowd of 25 women and children, being arrested for indecent exposure and fined $50 plus court costs. In January of 1985, Dahmer finally managed to get a job as a mixer at the Milwaukee Ambrosia Chocolate Factory, working 11 p.m. until 7 a.m. 6 nights a week, only having Saturday evenings off. Not long after getting the job, Dahmer was in the West Allis Public Library when another man threw a note at him, offering him oral sex. Dahmer didn't respond, but it did reignite the dominant fantasies he had as a teenager, leading to Dahmer frequently visiting Milwaukee's gay bars, gay bathhouses, and bookstores. He even stole a male mannequin from a store and used it for sexual stimulation, until his grandmother discovered it in his closet and demanded he get rid of it. By late 1985, Dahmer was regularly visiting bathhouses, which he found relaxing, but as he hooked up with men, he found it frustrating that they were moving during sex. He viewed them as objects of pleasure and not people. So as of June 1986, he began putting sleeping pills into drinks for his partners, and then raping their unconscious bodies. However, due to his suspicious behaviour, his membership was revoked and he was soon banned from the bathhouses, resorting to him visiting hotel rooms thereafter instead. Not long after, Dahmer read a newspaper about an 18-year-old man's funeral, which gave him the idea to dig up the corpse and take it home. He allegedly tried to do this, but the soil was far too hard to dig up, and he quickly abandoned the plan. In August, Jeffrey Dahmer masturbated in front of two 12-year-old boys at the Kinnickinnie River and was arrested. Originally, he confessed to the crime and was again charged for indecent exposure, but then changed his story and claimed that he was just urinating and didn't realise the two children were there. Due to this change of story, his charge was altered to disorderly conduct, and on March the 10th, 1987, he was sentenced to 1 year probation and was forced to go to counselling. On November the 20th, 1987, Jeffrey Dahmer still lived with his grandmother, but he met a 25-year-old man named Stephen Tuomi at a bar and invited him back to his room at the Ambassador Hotel in Milwaukee.
I was just planning on drugging him and spending the night with him. I had no intention of hurting him. When I woke up in the morning, he had a broken rib here. I was heavily bruised. My forearms were bruised, and his chest was bruised and blood was coming out of his mouth. He was hanging over the side of the bed. Apparently I had beaten him to death with my fists.
And you have no memory
I
of
have
it?
no memory of it. But that's what started the whole spree all over again. I have no memory of beating him to death, but I must have. And that's when it all started again.
And once it started again, you found it impossible to stop.
Right, that's when the obsession went into full swing.
Jeffrey couldn't believe that this had happened. Dahmer shoved Tuomi's body into a large suitcase to transport it to his grandmother's home. A week later, he severed the head, arms and legs before cutting the bones out from the body, and then cutting the flesh into small enough pieces to handle. He then placed the skin inside plastic bags, wrapped the bones inside a sheet, and pounded them into splinters with a sledgehammer. This entire process took around 2 hours, and then he simply disposed of all of Tuomi's remains in the trash. All except for his head.
As my obsession grew, I was saving body parts such as skulls and skeletons.
Dahmer kept it wrapped in a blanket, and after 2 weeks he boiled it in a mixture of Soilex and bleach to try to retain the skull, which he then used for masturbation.
Was there something sexual in the dismemberment of the bodies for you?
As time went on, yes, I did get there was a sexual part to that. I started saving the skeletons and preserving other parts, and one thing led to another. It took more and more deviant type behaviors to satisfy my urges.
However, the skull eventually became too brittle from all the bleach, and Dahmer had to destroy and get rid of it. It's believed that Dahmer just didn't remember this incident as he was intoxicated during the attack, though others believe it was split personality disorder. After the death of Tuomi, Dahmer became addicted and actively sought out victims near gay bars, which he would then lure back to his grandmother's house. 2 months later, Dahmer met a 14-year-old Native American prostitute named James Doxtader. He offered him $50 to pose for nude pictures at his home. Once there, they exchanged in sexual activity before Dahmer drugged him and strangled him in the cellar. He left the body there for an entire week before dismembering it the same way he did to Tuomi. He once again disposed of the remains but boiled and kept the skull, though he had the same results and had to eventually destroy and get rid of it.
I'd go to the nightclubs, drink, watch the striptease shows, and if I didn't meet anyone at the bars, I'd go to the bath clubs and meet someone there, offer them money, and we'd go back to the apartment, have a few drinks. I'd have the sleeping pill mixture already prepared. Person would drink it, fall asleep, and that's when they would be strangled.
On March the 24th, 1988, Jeffrey Dahmer met 22-year-old bisexual Richard Guerrero outside a gay bar. He offered him $50 just to spend the night with him, to which he agreed. Once at his home, he drugged Guerrero with sleeping pills before strangling him with a leather strap. Dahmer then performed oral sex on the corpse and then dismembered the body within the next 24 hours. Once again disposing of the remains in the trash. Like before, the skull became too brittle and had to be destroyed months later.
Was it the killing that excited you, or is it what happened after the killing?
No, the killing was just a means to an end. That was the least satisfactory part. I didn't enjoy doing that.
On April the 23rd, Dahmer lured an unknown man back to his house and once again drugged his coffee. However, his grandmother called down, "Is that you, Jeff?" Dahmer replied to suggest that he was alone, but she did look into the room to see that he wasn't. Due to this, Jeffrey didn't kill the man in question, but once he became unconscious from the drugged coffee, Dahmer took the man to the local hospital. In September, Jeffrey's grandmother finally asked him to move out due to him always bringing young men back to her house, as well as bizarre foul smells coming from the basement and the garage. It didn't take long for Jeffrey to land on his feet, however, finding his own apartment on North 25th Street, and he moved in on September the 25th. Just the next day, Jeffrey lured 13-year-old Konerak Sinthasomphone back to his home, asking him to pose for nude photographs, which is when he sexually assaulted him. Konerak was able to escape and quickly reported Dahmer to the authorities. In January 1989, Jeffrey Dahmer was convicted of second-degree sexual assault and of enticing a child. However, sentencing was suspended until May that year. On March the 20th, Dahmer had a 10-day Easter absence from work, which is when he moved back in with his grandmother. During this time, as he awaited his sentencing, on March the 25th, he met 24-year-old model Anthony Sears at a gay bar. Dahmer wasn't particularly looking for a crime, but he claimed that Sears began talking to him, so he lured him back to his grandmother's home. They performed oral sex on one another before Dahmer drugged and strangled him. The next morning, he placed the body in his grandmother's bathtub where he decapitated the corpse and then skinned the body. He stripped the flesh and destroyed the bones, which he again got rid of in the trash. Dahmer admitted he found Sears incredibly attractive and he was the first victim where he kept the remains, preserving his head and genitalia, storing them in acetone, an organic compound, keeping them in his work locker.
I kept the mummified head and skull of one of the victims in a carrying case in my locker at work.
Were you almost flaunting it?
Yes, but that's how strong the compulsion was. That's how bizarre the desire was. I wanted to keep something of the person with me.
Were there times when your dad may have been closer to discovering what was going on than even he knew?
The box incident was about as close as it came. Yeah.
It was about a 1 foot square box, metal and wood box.
My dad one week came to visit and happened to see it, and he was wondering what was in it. He didn't know. Nobody knew.
And I said, "Jeff, open it up." I just want to see what's in there.
We got into a bit of an argument because I wouldn't open it up.
And I said, Jeff, open it up or I'm going to just take it down into the basement and get a screwdriver or something and open it up.
I was thinking I've got to stop this from happening.
He got angry, very visibly agitated.
I thought, you know, it's all going to come crashing down now.
Not fathoming what could be in that box, I said, okay, we'll just open it up tomorrow then, and then let's get rid of it, whatever it is.
What was in the box?
The mummified head and genitals of a young man I met in one of the bars down in Milwaukee. But the box was never opened, not in my dad's presence.
On May the 23rd, 1989, Jeffrey Dahmer was sentenced to 5 years probation and 1 year in the House of Correction with work release, so he was able to keep his job, but he had to register as a sex offender. 2 months before the release of his work camp, he was paroled, and during this time he moved back in with his grandmother temporarily. But on May the 14th, 1990, he moved out to the Oxford Apartments on North 25th Street in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, taking the remains of Anthony Sears with him to his new home.
Could someone like you be stopped? Could you be helped?
No, I was dead set on going with this compulsion. It was the only thing that gave me any satisfaction.
Within just 1 week of moving in, Dahmer met 32-year-old prostitute Raymond Smith, promising him $50 for sex. Once inside his apartment, Dahmer gave him a drink with 7 sleeping pills laced inside, and then strangled him to death. The next day, Jeffrey bought a Polaroid camera, taking several pictures of the body in various positions before dismembering him in the bathroom. He boiled the legs, arms and pelvis in a steel kettle with Soilex, which allowed him to then rinse the bones in his sink. He proceeded to dissolve the rest of the remains in acid, but kept the skull. He spray painted it and kept it alongside the skull of Sears in a filing cabinet.
Why did you photograph them?
It was my way of remembering their appearance, their physical beauty. If I couldn't keep them there with me whole, at least I felt that I could keep their skeletons.
On May the 27th, Dahmer lured an unknown man back to his apartment, but on this occasion, Jeffrey accidentally drank the wrong drink and consumed the drugged one, passing out himself. Once waking up the next day, he realized the survivor had stolen several items of clothing, $300 and a watch. Dahmer chose to not report this incident to the police, though he did inform his probation officer that he had been robbed. In June, Dahmer lured a 27-year-old acquaintance of his by the name of Edward Smith to his apartment, where he drugged and strangled him to death. Edward was a known associate of Dahmer, and the reason for the sudden murder is unknown. For a change of routine, however, Jeffrey decided to place Smith's entire skeleton in the freezer for several months, hoping to retain the moisture, but this failed, and he would dissolve the remains in acid months later. He did intend to keep the skull as usual, but he placed it in his oven to dry, and it ended up exploding. Dahmer felt awful about this death, as he was unable to keep any body parts as a trophy for the murder.
There was no time when you would see them and say, "This is grotesque. What have I done?"
There were times, but the compulsive obsession with doing what I was doing overpowered any feelings of revulsion. Doing what I did was my way of feeling in complete control, at least for that situation. Creating my own little world where I had the final say, where I could completely control a person that I found physically attractive, and keep them with me as long as possible, even if it meant just keeping a part of them.
Just shy of 3 months later, Dahmer met 22-year-old Ernest Miller and asked him back to his place for $50, and claimed he wanted to listen to his heart and stomach. Once home, he attempted to give Ernest oral sex, but Miller claimed it would cost him extra. leading to Dahmer drugging his drink before slashing his neck with a knife. Ernest Miller died within 2 minutes.
Did you want to try to stop?
Yes, I tried. I tried to stop.
Jeffrey then posed the naked body in different positions before taking photographs and then dismembering it in the bathtub. He would also often kiss and talk to the severed head during the entire process. Dahmer wrapped his heart, biceps, and parts of flesh from the legs in plastic bags and even put them in his fridge to eat at a later time.
I was branching out. That's when the cannibalism started. Eating of the heart and the arm muscle. It was a way of making me feel that they were a part of me. At first it was just curiosity, and then it became compulsive.
He then boiled the remains with Soilex to turn them into jelly before rinsing the flesh off the skeleton, which he wanted to keep. He put the bones in a bleach solution for 24 hours before leaving them to dry for a week. He put the head in the fridge before stripping its flesh and then coating it with enamel.
Did you like feeling evil?
No, I didn't. But I had tried to overcome the thoughts, and it worked for a while, but eventually I gave in.
On September the 24th, Dahmer met 22-year-old David Thomas at the Grand Avenue Mall and invited him back to his place for some drinks and offered money for nude photographs. However, after drugging Thomas, he no longer felt attracted to him. He was too scared to let him wake up, expecting an angry reaction, which is the only reason Dahmer opted to strangle him to death. He then dismembered the body and didn't keep any of the parts, though he did photograph the dismemberment process and kept all of the pictures.
My name is Inez Thomas, and I'm the mother of David Thomas. You know, I don't understand how a person could really harm a person and to say that, well, I did this because he wasn't my type. Well, if everybody go around doing something to somebody because they're type, this would be a sad world today. And I just feel that this man should never be able to walk the face of the earth or to be able to harm anyone else again.
Their sexual preference didn't matter to me.
Did their race matter to you?
No, their race didn't matter to me. The first two young men were white. The third young man was American Indian. The fourth and fifth were Hispanic. So no, race had nothing to do with it. It was just their looks.
For the next 5 months, Dahmer didn't kill anyone and failed to successfully lure any man back to his home, which led to Jeffrey feeling senses of anxiety and depression, in addition to not feeling happy about his lifestyle and financial difficulties, even gaining suicidal thoughts. In February of 1991, Dahmer met 17-year-old Curtis Straughter at a bus stop near Marquette University. He promised him money for nude photographs as well as sexual relations. Once there, he drugged him before strangling him with a leather strap and dismembering him. Jeffrey kept his skull, hands, and genitals, once again taking photographs of the entire ordeal.
My name is Dorothy Straughter. I'm Curtis Straughter's mother. Just a few things that I would like to say. You took my 17-year-old son away from me. I'll never get a chance to tell him that I loved him. I'd have a chance to tell him that I loved him the last time I saw him, which will be a year tomorrow. You took my mother's oldest grandchild from her, and for that I can never forgive you.
I even went so far as planning on setting up an altar with the 10 different skulls and skeletons.
And what was the purpose of the altar going to be?
As a sort of memorial. A point where I could, I don't know. It's so bizarre and strange, it's hard to describe. A place where I could collect my thoughts and feed my obsession.
On April the 17th, Dahmer met 19-year-old Errol Lindsey, who was actually heterosexual. Jeffrey still managed to lure him back to his place where he drugged him and then drilled a hole into his skull before pouring hydrochloric acid inside it. He wanted to try this experiment out, intending to basically induce a permanent, unresistant and submissive state. Essentially a real-life zombie.
Then I tried to keep the person alive by inducing a zombie-like state, by injecting first dilute acid solution into their brain or hot water, and it never did completely work.
Lindsey woke up complaining of a headache, leading to Dahmer drugging him a second time before strangling him to death. He kept his head before skinning the body and placing the skin in a solution of cold water and salt for several weeks, hoping to permanently retain it. However, the skin, once again, became too frayed and brittle, and he had to get rid of it.
My name is Rita Isbell, and I'm the oldest sister of Errol Lindsey. Whatever your name is, say, I'm mad. This is how you act when you are out of control. I don't want to ever see my mother have to go through this again. Never, Jeffrey. Jeffrey, I hate you, motherfucker. I hate you. That is out of control. Don't fuck with me, Jeffrey. I'll kill you. God damn it. Look at me, motherfucker. I can kill you.
What's your name, sir? How do you feel about what you did?
I'm glad that it's over. There's nothing, any words I say to the victims' families are just going to seem trite and empty. I don't know how to express the regret, the sorrow, that I feel for what I've done for their sons. I can't find the right words.
By now, many residents of the apartments complained about foul smells coming from Dahmer's home, as well as several bizarre sounds of falling objects and even sounds of a chainsaw. Dahmer originally blamed the smell on his freezer breaking, causing the food to become spoiled, though he later changed his story and said that his fish had recently died, but he promised to sort the issue nonetheless. On May the 24th, Jeffrey met 31-year-old Tony Hughes and promised him money in exchange for nude photographs. Hughes was deaf and mute, so the two communicated with handwritten notes. Dahmer drugged and strangled him on his bedroom floor.
My name is Shirley Hughes, and I'm Tony Anthony Hughes' mother. I would like to say to Jeffrey Dahmer that he don't know the pain, the hurt, the loss, and the mental state that he had put our family in. 2 fingers and 1 thumb means I love you in sign language. My son was deaf.
On May the 26th, just 2 days later, before he had even dismembered the body of Hughes, Dahmer met 14-year-old Konerak Sinthasomphone, who coincidentally was the younger brother of Kazan, who Jeffrey had molested just a few years earlier. Dahmer offered him money to hang out with him and pose for some pictures. Originally he was reluctant, but then changed his mind, posing in his underwear, before Dahmer drugged him and performed oral sex whilst he was unconscious. Jeffrey then drilled into his skull before injecting hydrochloric acid. Before he fell unconscious, Dahmer had led the boy into his room, where the corpse of Tony Hughes still resided. Dahmer believes that Konerak saw the body but didn't react, probably due to the sleeping pills. Once unconscious, Dahmer drank several beers next to the body before leaving the apartment to drink at a bar and buying more alcohol. During his absence, Konerak awoken and left the apartment but was dazed from the acid injected into his brain. He was naked, drugged, and bleeding from the rectum. In the early hours, Dahmer returned home and discovered Konerak sitting outside naked on the corner, talking to 2 distressed women, Sandra Smith and Nicole Childress. Konerak was Laotian, though he spoke fluent English, but he was so dazed he couldn't communicate to the authorities about what was going on. Dahmer approached them and claimed that Konerak was his friend, and he tried to lead him away, but the ladies wouldn't let him and claimed that they had called the police. Once the officers showed up, John Balsazak and Joseph Gabrish found Dahmer genuine and completely relaxed. Jeffrey claimed that Konerak was his 19-year-old boyfriend and that he had drunk too much after they had an argument, and he often acted erratic once intoxicated. The women tried to intervene and even pointed out that Konerak was bleeding from his buttocks and that he was struggling whenever Dahmer tried to lead him away, but the officers told them to back off, to not interfere, and to shut up. The ladies knew Konerak and recognized him from the area, and they were genuinely convinced that his life was in danger, but their concerns were ignored. The police simply covered Konerak with a towel and walked him back to Dahmer's apartment. Jeffrey showed them the underwear photos to prove that they were in a relationship. The officers did notice a strange smell coming from inside Dahmer's apartment, and one of them did poke their head in to look around the room, but didn't choose to have a proper search. They left Konerak with Dahmer, asking him to take good care of the boy. Neither checked for Konerak's identification or try to find out who he truly was, nor did they check Dahmer's. If they had simply done a background check on Jeffrey, they would have seen that he was a convicted child molester under probation who had molested Konerak's brother years earlier. As soon as they had left the premises, Dahmer injected more hydrochloric acid into the boy's brain, this time killing him. The next day, Dahmer took the day off work to dismember both corpses in his apartment, and he kept both of their skulls.
Do you still feel those same urges? Do you still feel that compulsion, that obsession?
I wish I could say that it just left completely, but no, there are times when I still do have the old compulsions.
Due to the police response being publicised, as well as an audio clip of both Balsazak and Gabrish making homophobic slurs about the situation over the radio, as well as mocking the situation, both police officers were terminated. The city of Milwaukee paid the family $850,000 to settle a lawsuit over how the police handled the situation that day. Regardless, both officers appealed the decision to terminate them, and they were actually reinstated. But they denied any wrongdoing on that night. God is my witness, I didn't just dump a little boy in the hands of a murderer. That's not what happened. We're trained to be observant and spot things. There was just nothing that stood out or we would have seen it. I've been doing this for a while, and usually if something stands out, you'll spot it. There just wasn't anything there. Some believe they only left the foreign boy with the white Jeffrey Dahmer because of the colour of their skins. Especially because the women who found the boy were black, and the officers were white, though they both wholeheartedly deny this being a racial issue.
10 of your 17 victims were black. Were they racially motivated?
It was not racially motivated. It was not sexual preference. It was just to find an obsession with the best-looking young man I could find.
On June the 30th, Jeffrey Dahmer travelled to Chicago, where he met 20-year-old Matt Turner at a bus station. Dahmer offered him the chance to travel to his home in Milwaukee for a professional photo shoot. Once there, Jeffrey drugged, strangled, and dismembered him, placing his head and internal organs in several plastic bags in his freezer. Turner was never reported missing. Just 5 days later, Dahmer met 23-year-old Jeremiah Weinberger at a bar and lured him back to his apartment, promising to spend the weekend with him. He then drugged him and injected boiling water into his skull twice, which put him into a coma where he died 2 days later. Dahmer noted that this is one of the most exceptional deaths to him, as he was the only one to die with his eyes open. On July the 15th, Jeffrey Dahmer met 24-year-old bodybuilding enthusiast Oliver Lacy, asking him to pose for nude photographs. Once in Dahmer's apartment, they both engaged in sexual activities before Jeffrey drugged him. However, this time, Dahmer wanted to prolong the experience and spend more time with him while he was alive. He attempted to render Oliver unconscious with chloroform, but then phoned his work to ask for a day off, though the next day he was suspended. Once off the phone, he then strangled Lacy to death before having sex with the corpse and dismembering him. He placed his head and heart in the fridge with his skeleton in the freezer. 4 days later, Dahmer was fired from his job. That same day, he lured 25-year-old Joseph Bradehoft back to his home, where he strangled him and then left him covered in a sheet on his bed for 2 days. On July the 21st, Dahmer removed the sheets to find the head covered in maggots, leading to him decapitating the body, cleaning the head and placing it inside his fridge. He later dissolved the torso as well as 2 other victims with acid.
Good morning, Honor. My name is Donald Bradehoft. For the Bradehoft family, I would like to say that I am My mother gave 5 beautiful kids. We lost. He destroyed the baby of the family. And I hope you go to hell.
What was the turning point for you that made you suddenly realize that you had done something terribly wrong, something you should be sorry for?
It was the night of the arrest.
On July the 22nd, 1991, Jeffrey Dahmer approached 3 men, offering any of them $100 to spend time with him, have some drinks, and pose for naked photographs. Only one agreed: 32-year-old Tracy Edwards. As soon as they entered Dahmer's apartment, he noticed a foul smell, as well as several boxes of hydrochloric acid on the floor, which Dahmer claimed he used for cleaning bricks.
Why, first it was a foul odor, okay?
Tell us about that. What kind of an odor?
It was just like an odor. I didn't quite know what it was. You know, he told me a sewer pipe had broke and management would take care of it.
After some small chat, Dahmer turned Tracy's attention to his pet tropical fish, and once distracted, Jeffrey put a handcuff on his wrist. He then attempted to handcuff both his wrists together but failed. Regardless, he asked Tracy to accompany him to the bedroom to pose for some naked pictures.
At times he would go through like different changes with me, you know.
Tell us about that.
One minute he's like nice, and then he was telling he didn't want people to leave him or abandon him, things of this nature, you know. Yeah.
Well, what did you think about him as a person? What impression was made on your mind of this fella that you're dealing with here?
Yeah. That at times he wasn't himself, and then at times he was like a nice guy, you know. He would come and go different times, you know.
Once inside, Tracy noticed several nude male posters on the wall, and a video of the popular horror movie The Exorcist 3 was playing on the television.
I felt so hopelessly evil and perverted that I actually derived a sort of pleasure from watching that tape.
Was there any parts of the movie that was going on that you saw that he said anything about?
It was like the part about the preacher that used to be a preacher that had got possessed, and that it would seem like he was like interested in that part. That part had his attention more than anything.
There was also a blue 57-gallon drum in the corner, which had a strong smell emanating from it. At this point, Dahmer pulled out a knife and said he wanted to take naked pictures of Tracy. Edwards didn't want to upset him, so he unbuttoned his shirt and promised to let him do so if he removed the handcuff and put the knife away. Dahmer didn't respond to this, but he did turn his attention to the television. He began rocking back and forth, quietly chanting as he was fixated on the Exorcist movie. Dahmer then placed his head onto Tracy's chest, listening to his heartbeat and pressing his knife against him, claiming he wanted to eat his heart. Tracy insisted that he was Dahmer's friend and promised to not run away, though he was internally planning to either jump out one of the windows or run through the front door that he remembered Dahmer didn't lock. Tracy asked to use the bathroom and then requested for them to sit in the living room together to have some drinks, stating he needed the air conditioning. Once there, after Dahmer lost his concentration, Tracy once again asked to use the bathroom, but then quickly punched Jeffrey in the face and sprinted out of the front door. At 11:30 p.m, Tracy Edwards managed to flag down 2 Milwaukee police officers, Robert Roth and Rolf Mueller. They noticed the handcuffs still attached to his wrist, and he claimed that a freak had put them on him, but their handcuff keys failed to remove them. He then took the officers to the home of Jeffrey Dahmer, where Tracy had just spent 5 hours being held captive.
I have no memory of what happened during the 6 hours before the last victim ran out of the apartment. I heard a knock on the door, and the police were there with the last victim. They asked me where the key was to the handcuffs. My mind was in a haze. I sort of pointed to the bedroom, and that's where they found the pictures. And they yelled, "Cuff him."
Once there, Dahmer invited Tracy and the police officers inside and openly confessed to putting the handcuff on him, but didn't explain why. Tracy then retold the story of Dahmer pulling a knife on him in the bedroom. Jeffrey didn't react to this, but informed them that the key to the cuffs was in his bedroom. Dahmer went to retrieve the key himself but was stopped, as Mueller instead entered and quickly found the knife under the bed. He also found an open drawer containing several Polaroid pictures of him dismembering so many of his victims. They recognized the apartment from the pictures and realized that this was real. As soon as he returned, photos in hand, Dahmer tried to fight them off to resist arrest, to no avail. As he was on the floor being handcuffed, Jeffrey Dahmer stated, "For what I did, I should be dead," before he was taken to the patrol car and finally arrested.
It was just the realization that there was no point in trying to hide my actions anymore. The best route was to help the police identify all the victims and just make a complete confession.
Mueller investigated the fridge to discover a freshly severed head of a black man on the bottom shelf. Further inspection led to them finding 4 severed heads in Dahmer's kitchen. A total of 7 skulls, some painted and some bleached, were inside his bedroom and closet. There was blood dripping on a tray at the bottom of his fridge, as well as 2 human hearts and a portion of arm muscle, each wrapped inside plastic bags. In his freezer, they found an entire torso, as well as a bag of human organs and flesh stuck to the ice at the bottom. They found 2 entire skeletons, a pair of severed hands, 2 severed and preserved penises, a mummified scalp, and in the 57-gallon drum, 3 dismembered torsos were dissolving in acid. 74 Polaroid pictures of dismemberment were also discovered. The officers described it as more of someone's own personal museum than an actual crime scene.
If you were out on the street now, would you still be committing the crimes?
Probably. If this hadn't happened, there's no doubt I probably would be. I can't think of anything that would have stopped me.
In the early hours the next day, Jeffrey Dahmer was questioned, which led to 2 weeks of numerous interviews, totaling over 60 hours. Dahmer waived his right to have a lawyer present and just wanted to immediately confess to everything he had done. He claimed, "I created this horror, and it only makes sense I do everything to put an end to it." He admitted to murdering 16 young men in Wisconsin, as well as Stephen Hicks in Ohio way back in 1978. Most of his victims were unconscious when they were killed, though some died as a result of having acid or boiling water injected into their brains. He didn't remember murdering Tuomi, but due to how we found him, he believes he tried to tear his heart out from his chest. He also confessed to necrophilia to most of the victims' bodies, even performing sexual acts with their viscera. Dahmer admitted he got swept along with his addiction to kill. "I'd been completely swept along. It was an incessant and never-ending desire to be with someone at whatever cost. Someone good-looking, really nice-looking. It just filled my thoughts all day long." He claimed if he was arrested 6 months later, they would have discovered the fully built altar in his bedroom. A place where he could finally call home. On July the 25th, 1991, Jeffrey Dahmer was charged with 4 counts of first-degree murder. By August the 22nd, he had been charged with a further 11. On September the 14th, investigators had discovered hundreds of bone fragments in wooded areas that Dahmer had confessed to discarding the remains of Stephen Hicks. 3 days later, he was also charged with that murder. However, he wasn't charged for the attempted murder of Tracy Edwards, nor the murder of Tuomi. By Milwaukee law, they could only bring forth charges when murder could be proven beyond reasonable doubt. But Dahmer had no memory of actually killing Tuomi, and no physical evidence existed. On January the 13th, 1992, Jeffrey Dahmer pled guilty, but insane, to 15 counts of murder.
Your Honor, it is over now. This has never been a case of trying to get free. I didn't ever want freedom. Frankly, I wanted death for myself. This was a case to tell the world that I did what I did not for reasons of hate. I hated no one. I knew I was sick or evil or both. Now I believe I was sick. The doctors have told me about my sickness, and now I have some peace. I know how much harm I have caused. I tried to do the best I could after the arrest to make amends, but no matter what I did, I could not undo the terrible harm I have caused. I feel so bad for what I did to those poor families, and I understand their rightful hate. I decided to go through this trial for a number of reasons. One of the reasons was to let the world know that these were not hate crimes. I wanted the world in Milwaukee, which I deeply hurt, to know the truth of what I did. I didn't want unanswered questions. All the questions have now been answered. I wanted to find out just what it was that caused me to be so bad and evil. But most of all, Mr. Boyle and I decided that maybe there was a way for us to tell the world that if there are people out there with these disorders, maybe they can get some help before they end up being hurt or hurting someone. I think the trial did that.
It's also worth noting that Jeffrey Dahmer would deliberately never wear his glasses in court just so he couldn't see the faces of his victims or their families. During his trial, which began on January the 30th, 1992, it was highly debated whether or not Dahmer was mentally ill or had a personality disorder. The prosecution claimed that even if he had a disorder, it would not rid Jeffrey of the ability to differentiate between right and wrong. Though others believe he had a mental disease where he was driven by obsessions and impulses that he was genuinely unable to control. The fact that he performed necrophilia led people to believe that he was clinically insane. Many professors of psychology backed up this theory, including Dr. Fred Berlin and Dr. Judith Becker. It's believed he even had borderline personality disorder, schizotypal personality disorder, alcohol dependence, or a psychotic disorder. However, the theory that Dahmer was insane was rejected, arguing that he still drugged and had sex with living people. Others also argued that his murders were carefully calculated, and he had to have been of sound mind, especially since he only attacked people when he was alone and devoid of any witnesses. Furthermore, he often relied on alcohol, which he wouldn't have needed to if he was clinically insane. Eventually, after much deliberation, on February the 15th, 1992, Dahmer was ruled to have been completely sane. For the first 2 counts of murder, he was sentenced to life imprisonment plus 10 years, with the remaining 13 counts carrying a mandatory sentence of life imprisonment plus 70 years. The death penalty was not given as the state of Wisconsin had abolished this back in 1853, but in total, Jeffrey Dahmer was sentenced to 999 years in prison. After hearing the sentence, Lionel and his wife Sherry wanted to speak with their son privately. They exchanged hugs and well wishes, though it's uncertain what was exactly said, before Jeffrey Dahmer was escorted away.
When you were a teenager, you had dreams of committing murder yourself?
Almost always after I was either physically or in some other way harassed by bullies, I would wake up, say, the next morning, and I would have this feeling that I had hurt someone, that I had maybe hurt them badly, that I had killed them.
3 months later, on May the 1st, Dahmer was taken to Ohio to be tried for the murder of Stephen Hicks, where he again pled guilty and was sentenced to a 16th term of life imprisonment. Jeffrey Dahmer was transferred to the Columbia Correctional Institution. For his first year, he was placed in solitary confinement in fear that other inmates would harm him, or worse, or vice versa. After a year had passed, Dahmer gave his consent and they transferred him to a less secure unit, where he was even given a 2-hour daily work routine cleaning the toilets. Around this time, Dahmer had converted to Christianity and became a born-again Christian. He also started reading creationist books at the request of his father. In May of 1994, Jeffrey was baptized by minister Roy Ratcliffe, who had become a frequent visitor. Dahmer questioned Ratcliffe whether he was sinning against God simply by living. If a person doesn't think that there is a God to be accountable to, then what's the point of trying to modify your behaviour to keep it within acceptable ranges? That's how I thought anyway. In July of 1994, another inmate, Osvaldo DeRuthi, tried to slash Dahmer's throat with a razor that was embedded in a toothbrush as Jeffrey returned to his cell after his weekly church service. Dahmer received some wounds but wasn't seriously hurt. According to many witnesses, including Jeffrey's own family, he was ready to die and had been for a while. He happily endured any punishment in prison because he knew that he deserved it. All three of his parents always remained in full contact with their son at this point, even though Dahmer hadn't seen his mother since Christmas of 1983 beforehand.
Your dad has wondered about all kinds of things, from the medication that your mom was on during her pregnancy, to the fact that you were exposed to violent arguments in the home from an early age and continuing, to the possibility that he might have passed on some genetic propensity for obsession or violent behavior. Does any of that ring true to you?
I can see why he'd wonder about those things, but as far as I'm concerned, they're all excuses. I feel it's wrong for people who commit crimes to try to shift the blame onto somebody else, onto their parents or onto their upbringing or living circumstances. I think that's just a cop-out. I take full responsibility.
Dahmer even told his mum during this time he doesn't care if he gets abused or killed, because he said it just didn't matter anymore. On the morning of November the 28th, 1994, Jeffrey Dahmer left his cell to check his usual assigned work routine. He went with two inmates, Jesse Anderson and Christopher Scarver, but the trio were left unsupervised in the showers of the gym for only around 20 minutes. At 8:10 AM, Jeffrey Dahmer was discovered on the floor with extreme head and facial wounds, having been bludgeoned with a metal bar. His head had also been struck against the wall several times. Dahmer was still alive but was rushed to hospital, though he died an hour later. Jesse Anderson had also been beaten and also passed away just 2 days on. Christopher Scarver was serving a life sentence after committing murder in 1990, and he claimed he attacked Dahmer as he was cleaning a staff locker room before turning on Anderson. He stated Jeffrey Dahmer didn't even yell or make any sounds during the attack. Afterwards, he casually went back to his cell and informed a prison guard that God told him to do it. He claims he didn't plan the attack, though he later admitted he hid a 20-inch iron bar in his clothing shortly before killing them. He later claimed that he attacked them because they had both poked him in the back as they were working, and then proceeded to laugh at him. He claimed he approached Dahmer with a newspaper about his killings and asked if they were true, but Jeffrey was fairly unresponsive, making him even angrier. He claimed that Dahmer often upset other inmates by shaping his food like severed limbs and using ketchup to imitate blood. He claimed prison staff knew he hated Dahmer and deliberately left them alone, hoping he would kill him. Dahmer was so hated by other inmates that he always needed at least one guard to walk with him to other locations. Weirdly, Jeffrey Dahmer stated in his will that he didn't want any services for his death, but he did want to be cremated. His ashes were divided between his parents. After hearing the news, Joyce responded to the media in an angry rage. Now is everyone happy? Now that he's bludgeoned to death, is that good enough for everyone? Most of the public were pleased with his death, though others cited that it was still murder and Scarver was anything but a hero. On May the 15th, 1995, Scarver was sentenced to 2 more terms of life imprisonment for the 2 new murders. The Oxford Apartments at 924 North 25th Street in Milwaukee, where Dahmer had killed so many of his victims, was completely demolished in November of 1992, and it now remains a vacant lot. There were plans to turn the land into a memorial garden for the victims, but nothing has since materialized. Between 1978 and 1991, Jeffrey Dahmer is confirmed to have murdered a minimum of 17 men, 12 of which were in his apartment in North 25th Street in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. Lionel Dahmer is now retired and still lives with his second wife Sherry, both of which refused to change their last name and continue to profess their love for their son despite his crimes. Lionel even released a book in 1994 called A Father's Story, trying to find out where, why and how he failed so much as a father, and he even donated some of the profits to the victims' families. Most of the community showed support for them, though others did blame them for negligent parenting. Joyce sadly passed away from cancer in November of 2000, and Jeffrey's younger brother David has since changed his last name and has vanished from the public eye and hasn't been heard from since. Jeffrey Dahmer. the Milwaukee cannibal, left his mark on this world and still gets talked about nearly 30 years later. From a troubled childhood of neglect to dangerous alcohol abuse, there's many conflicting theories to what sent this young man on a horrible journey of murder and misery. What truly caused this horrific rampage to have begun? It's been 26 years since he left the world, and we are still seeking answers.